The Mafia Dons, corrupt cops and crooked bookkeepers of Australian finance exposed, and the Aussie scapegoat in the anti-China war agenda. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 20th of July 2023. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director Robbie Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be showing you how the banks, the big banks' lies are catching up with them. And we're going to talk about the case of Dan Duggan, another in a series of cases a la Julian Assange, whistleblower cases galore that are accruing and mounting up that we need to take on. Now, don't forget, hit the like button to help the video circulate, subscribe, share it as widely as you can, and there'll be a link below as well where you can donate if you support what we're doing. Now, before we start on the main topics, we do have a quick update and call to action for all of our good supporters out there who are used to harassing the politicians on various issues, and as we know, it makes a huge impact. We've had some major victories, and this one is on the social media censorship law, which you talked about on last week's show.
No, that's right. So last week we put out the call for people to make submissions to the exposure draft. So we've put out a release this week with the details in it, plus we have a 3-page article in here by Solicitor Bob Butler, which is a detailed examination of the bill, right? So people can see what's actually in the bill, so that they know when the government uses the language it does to reassure people that this is not infringent on their civil liberties and their freedom of speech. They'll be able to see that the government's being deliberately disingenuous, right? Anyway, so that's there. It's clear. I did a show on this a few days ago with Martin North when there was 21 days to go for this consultation period in which people can get in their submissions, and Martin called it 21 days to 1984, and because it is Orwellian, right? So we've actually explained the all the implications in there. So if you need those details, go on our website and look at the press release and look at the article. So now there's fewer than 20 days to go. Please make a submission
By the 6th of August.
Or else a lot of what we're going to talk about in this show, Elisa, would risk being classified as misinformation or disinformation, and then we wouldn't be able to talk about it. I mean, you and I would be able to talk about it in this room together. The government's not going to bash down the door and stop us from doing that. But we could go crank out a printing press maybe, right, and publish a whole bunch of things. As we do, and they're not going to break down the printing press. But the mass social media phenomenon would just be blocked, right? And it wouldn't even be one detail at a time. What they're doing is they're pushing the platforms into designing algorithms to preemptively block everything that might come up, that might be construed as that. And so one of the areas that we talk about a lot, which I can tell you would be considered disinformation, is foreign policy. And just on that, I want to make a very quick point, which is also by way of an update. We spent the last few weeks in the lead up to the NATO summit in Vilnius. We went very big warning people about the danger of a false flag attack around the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, right? Which the Ukrainians were warning was going to be a false flag attack by the Russians, even though the Russians controlled the plant and it's in Russian-controlled territory. Zelensky, and there was all this hysteria about the Russians are going to blow up the Zaporozhye plant, and Zelensky claimed they'd mined a number of the reactors, etc., etc. We said, and based on very good sources, no, the opposite is true. The only people that would benefit from that would be Zelensky with his agenda to bring in to bring NATO into the war, which idiotic Americans like Senator Lindsey Graham were helping with, right? So we said that. And we made a big deal about warning it because we wanted to warn people that this was being thought of in the lead up to the NATO summit. It hasn't happened. Doesn't mean it won't happen. It hasn't happened. But the point is, now that the NATO summit's over, on the anti-Russian side, the news has completely dropped. any discussion of this possibility of an attack that Zelensky had been screaming about. And we on this show played clips of the Rafael Grossi, who I mistakenly called Italian, turns out he's Argentinian, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, contradicting Zelensky in real time, saying, no, we're on the ground, right? So we did our bit to debunk this before it could happen. And we are one of the voices that I'm sure helped stop it from happening, right? If that was the plan. And the fact that the Western media have just dropped all talk of the danger of this shows you it was the plan, right? But we made it so they wouldn't get away with it. That's exactly the sort of thing that this kind of bill would be able to shut down. All the kind of warnings we put out, they'd be able to shut that down, right? So that's an example. There's lots of different reasons to be concerned about what they call misinformation, disinformation. I've highlighted some foreign policy discussion ones. There's lots of different reasons. Engage, defend your right to freedom of speech, make a submission before the 6th of August.
Well, another example of that suppression of how we get the word out is in our first topic, the Mafia Dons, corrupt cops and crooked bookkeepers of Australian finance exposed, because certainly the banks would love to have a mechanism to suppress the kind of message we're putting out and our collaborators are putting out at the moment, where we are putting a spotlight and not letting it stray elsewhere on the lies that are coming out of the mouths of the CEOs of the major banks. And there's a bunch of them. We mentioned some of them last week. You showed some videos. We're just going to recap that.
Just to explain the title, I think, because we're going to fill in the gaps, but it just occurred to us there's 3 different aspects of Australia's financial system that's really under intense scrutiny right now. One is the banks, and we've been right at the centre of that, especially on the question of branch closures. I'll round on that. So we've called them the Mafia Dons, but the Mafia Dons are never able to operate alone. They need minions, and there's a few types. One of them is the crooked. So go watch the movie The Untouchables, and think of Chicago and under Al Capone, right? There's the Mafia Dons. He had the corrupt cops, and those are the regulators, and they're under huge scrutiny. And then the bookkeepers. And remember, in the movie, it comes down to the bookie. They had to get the bookie in order to show what Al Capone's crimes. And the bookies are the accountants, right? And in this case, the big 4 global accounting firms, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young, right? EY. They're really copying it in Australia, and so they should. And so these are the major elements of the financial system that is so corrupt. It's victimised hundreds of thousands of Australians. It's destroyed the productivity of our economy, etc. So we'll fill in the details now, but that's where the
we're going to spend a bit of time on each of those 3 areas, because they are all getting a grilling at the moment, and it's actually really testament to the political process and how it can work that this is happening, because it's coming from the Senate and the Senate inquiry process and various economics committees in the House and so forth that are putting the heat on. And the only input that they're getting is from the likes of organisations like ourselves and our collaborators and you guys out there. It's siphoning up the chain. It's getting back to MPs. They know they have to take these matters seriously. So the House Economics Committee has had in the chambers for scrutiny the CEOs of all the big 4 banks. So just to recap some of what we discussed last week, Chairman Labor MP Daniel Molino put right up front questioning about regional banking closures that these CEOs have been overseeing.
Which reflects the work we've done in the other committee. It's shaping this committee now.
Yeah. So ANZ Chair Shane Elliott had to admit that the bank has closed almost half of its branches since he became CEO in 2017, but went on to mislead the hearing by claiming that they hadn't closed any remote branches when in fact they've closed some 24% of them.
Now, Elisa, this was commented on social media, and that he had misled the hearing by pretending that they hadn't shut these 24% of branches in what designated as remote areas. ANZ was so incensed, they called and demanded that comment be removed. Now, That's ANZ trying to intimidate somebody. In reality, that's ANZ freaking out, right? ANZ is the one who is intimidated. And that just shows you that the process, we knew we'd scored big against Westpac. They were forced to reverse 8 branch closures. We knew we'd scored big against Commonwealth Bank. They had to we'll come back to them in a minute, they had to put a 3-year moratorium on regional branch closures. Now we're seeing ANZ freaking out at this attention, right? They're so thin-skinned about this, but they're the ones who did it. They're the ones that ANZ misled. Shane Elliott misled the hearing last week. Let me say it again. Call me, ANZ. Robert Barwick, 1-800, you can call them the toll-free number, 1-800-636-432. Tell me to apologise for this. Shane Elliott misled the hearing last week. Shane Elliott misled the hearing last week.
We won't even put you on hold for 2 hours.
That's right. We could do that. We could pass the call around to everyone in the office. That's what they did, right? If you don't do that, people are going to call you out. But now they can't ignore. Like the social media account has 1,000 followers. The 4th biggest bank in Australia freaked out at someone saying that, right?
Yep.
So that's them being really, really sensitive thanks to this effort.
And it just goes to show if they had censorship laws, they'd make use of them one way or the other. Now, NAB in the stand was forced to own up to its own lies as well, because they'd put out these figures, as regular viewers would remember, showing that bank interactions are down. But of course, that really was it was a misleading figures, because it's only counting people that are doing your basic banking transactions. And to his credit, Daniel Molino drilled down on this and demanded to know, well, hang on, what about all the other people coming into the bank, for all manner of other things? And he listed a bunch of them. So what he said, obviously you keep data on this, and the chair had to hand over to his sidekick.
The CEO, Ross McEwen. Ross McEwen, by the way, is a Kiwi, as is Shane Elliott. I don't know how I feel about 2 Kiwis being in charge of our 2 biggest banks. But then on the other hand, we probably shouldn't make too big a deal about it, because we own their banks. They're out. Anyway. So Ross McEwen, though, he could tell the heat was on this question. He handballed it to Rachel Slade, and I love what Martin North has done with this clip. So
her response.
Martin, apologies to Martin North. We're borrowing Martin's clip. He's done a great job, because it really is this big a deal. Watch.
But I'm just wondering, of the data you collect about branch activity, obviously that kind of engagement has reduced, but what about people coming into the bank to talk to somebody at the bank to help them navigate the digital system? How many interactions are there of a different nature? And I imagine, you probably record that, all the different kinds of things people do when they come in.
Some of that will be recorded and some of it won't, but I'll pass to Rachel, because Rachel has the information. It's her network and she sees what's coming in and out every day. But maybe if you can take...
It's a great question, and those interactions that don't result in a transaction, they're actually very challenging to measure. We don't measure them. We don't measure them. We don't measure them.
In other words, Elisa, when she says we don't measure them, you know what that means? They have absolutely no proof that branch visitations have fallen.
Which is the basis for branch closures.
Yes. Now, can I say, think this through, I think I've explained this in previous weeks. What does she mean they don't measure them? Well, when these big megalithic corporations, megalithic means rocks, I think, monolithic corporations, access their data, they get off their computers, right? And they don't have someone standing at the door with a ticker counting everyone going in and out. They want to employ as few people as possible. So they're only extracting data that's from their computers. And the computers only record deposits and withdrawals. So here's the thing. If that's true for for NAB, that they're only recording deposits and withdrawals when they talk about this data, that's true for all of them, right? And so that just the other day, we put it on the front page of the alert. Our friend of the show, Paul Thomas, cash and transit guy, was in the Westpac Bank in Revesby, Westpac St George branch in Revesby, and he just sent me a photo. There's a queue out the door. It's chockers.
And even if they counted everyone that got to the counter, What about all the people that leave in disgust or are told they can't do their transaction because we don't carry cash or something?
Angela Cramp told me about that, the head of the LPO group. The last time we talked about this, she was queuing up at NAB to have to do some banking, and one teller, there were 6 of them, and half hour to go before closing time, and people just started peeling out of the queue because they knew they weren't going to get served, right? So they're full of it, and that has now come out. And the thing is, though, this is the whole rationale for closing branches. They're not being used. We now have proof. They have no proof that they're not being used, right? And this really has to be rammed home through the senators and through the parliament and put these banks back in their place.
So there are more hearings coming up for the regional banking closure inquiry soon in Western Australia, which will be the next point of interface.
That's right. That's the 13th and 14th of August in Western Australia. So the 13th in Carnama, WA, and I'm really happy they got a hearing because, have I got those dates right?
The 15th.
14th and 15th.
15th is the Tuesday in Carnama and the 16th, unless I've got that wrong.
No, lucky
it's
you're
in
here.
Beverly.
Okay, whatever.
Check the calendar.
whatever the Tuesday and Wednesday is of the 3rd week of August, we'll get the producer to put the exact dates on the screen. Carnama in WA and then Beverly in WA. 15th and 16th. 15th and 16th. Okay, even spoke up. Okay. Thank you, producer. You want a seat at the desk?
Quite happy with that.
He's happy there. Okay, but speaking of cashless branches, CBA has made an announcement.
All right, now, so we're still winning against these banks. I don't want to don't assume we're not, but also don't be surprised when the banks have to retreat because we're forced them to retreat. And then they come up with something devious, right?
Obviously.
Because they're banks. They're always going to come up with something devious. They don't go back to the boardroom and say, how could we better serve the people of Australia? That's not the discussion that happens around the boardroom. It is, what do we have to do to con these fools
into thinking
that we're serving them, right? So what Commonwealth Bank has announced is that it's opening up these specialist. They say a small number of specialist city centres in the CBDs or the inner city areas of Sydney and Melbourne and whatnot, and they will not be for deposits and withdrawals. They will be cashless. Okay, here's what I'd say about that. What they are not doing, what those centres is not branches. They are not branches. A branch is defined in the law, not in an APRA regulation, the law, in legislation. A bank branch is defined as accepting deposits and giving change. And change, Elisa, doesn't just mean paper, it means coins. That's why the branch that tells you to go and get your money out of the ATM is also not a branch, right? Now, this has been in the law for years and years. In other words, the true number of branch closures in Australia is greater than it appears because all those, CBA is now copying ANZ, all those ANZ and CBA cashless centres must not be counted as branches. APRA is the regulator to enforce that, but because they're banks, what does APRA do? It's ignored it, and once, this was one of the first victories Dale Webster had, and because she got this raised in Parliament, Dale Webster, the independent journalist who's done all the work on this, one of the first, she showed, look, they're getting away with counting branches that aren't branches. So APRA, instead of enforcing the law, and opened a consultation process with the banks to change the law, because they are the banks. So wouldn't that be nice if, we have this law in Victoria now that if I touch my mobile phone while I'm driving, the first thing that will happen is you'll yell at me. The second thing that will happen is, what is it, an $800 fine or something ridiculous, right?
600.
What if the policeman who comes to my car door says, let me consult with you. Would you like me to change that law? Right? Would you like that? I'd say, sure, thumbs up. Well, we don't get treated like that, the banks do. And that's, anyway, we're not going to they can be weasel, so they can't help themselves. This is their nature as banks. they're going to try and weasel on everything. We will keep hammering them on everything.
Now that's the banking dons. Now onto their corrupt cops, the regulators. Now, as viewers again would know, there's an inquiry.
We just mentioned one, APRA.
And there's an inquiry into ASIC, the Australian Securities Investments Commission, which is another regulator. It's meant to police investments and so forth. As we know, it absolutely does not. Now, John Adams, the independent economist, has had a big input into the ongoing inquiry, and he's just revealed, you did an interview with him on Citizens Insight, which people can see on our YouTube channel if that's where you're watching this now, the next show down on the list. John revealed that a number of people in the media were contacted by ASIC saying that John Adams is a nutcase. You know, in other words, trying to put them off.
Shoot the messenger.
From working with him and discredit John in the eyes of the inquiry.
I assured John he was not a nutcase when it came to ASIC. What's the show? John and I talk a lot, as you know, and the interview I did with him this week was a lot of fun because, in a sense, what you're seeing in that interview is the conversations that he and I have quite intensely about these subjects because we're constantly strategizing about pushing our campaigns forward to try and get results. We were at some of the, without airing all the most sensitive stuff, essentially you get to see us having a conversation like we have a lot every single day, where we're sharing with the viewer the kind of thinking that goes into this campaign. And in this case, what ASIC tried to do to John is what ANZ tried to do to the social media post, right? Shut it down, take it out. And in this case, he showed, and we've covered this a lot, but you know his report was devastating. They don't, not only don't they enforce the law, they don't even investigate to enforce the law, right? This is a dysfunctional regulator, as we called it. And the freak out that's coming now, we can see coming out of ASIC is absolutely enormous. Yeah. And a lot of it's being revealed through freedom of information requests that John Adams has put in. Yeah,
so he also did a show with Martin North on Interests of the People, which you can watch, and you can find the link to that. We'll put it below, revealing that his freedom of information requests show that the head of ASIC, Joe Longo, tried to manipulate Parliament to take the heat off him and off ASIC in this inquiry, which again just goes to show that this inquiry is hitting payload.
And this is a lot more serious than going around to backgrounding journalists saying, "Oh, he's a nutcase." A lot more serious than that. That's not good either. That's pretty bad. That shows how weak ASIC is. But there's a separation of powers, Elisa, and so ASIC, as a government regulator, is part of the executive. The Parliament is the legislature, and it makes the laws. And it has oversight over the enforcement, the following of the laws, right? And so what Joe Longo tried to do, there's actually two instances now. When there was, when John Adams' report first came out, one of these FOI requests revealed that someone at ASIC said, "Oh, can we put in a Dorothy Dixer about this?" A Dorothy Dixer means you feed a member of Parliament a softball question so that they can ask it to you in public and you can answer it in the way you want. That already shows an improper relationship between ASIC and its oversight. Because look, the reason ASIC is so sick is because the two major parties forever have let it be sick. That's the problem, right? They're part of this. So there's that part of it. And then, Longo freaked out at the terms of reference for this inquiry that Senator Bragg is chairing, and he actually posed the question in these documents. Oh, can we water it down? Right? Can we get another committee to get it watered down? Now so we don't know how that transpired, but the fact that the question is being asked displays this improper relationship. This is a breach of the separation of powers, right? And potentially worse.
And the fact that it is hurting ASIC is also shown in another fight brewing this week, which is reports in the media showing that ASIC has refused to hand over files to the Treasurer despite being ordered by the Senate to do so.
The best part of that is the response of the chairman, Andrew Bragg. And have a look at the interview, like I said. You'll see me ask John about Senator Bragg because, you know, a lot of this does come down to the quality of the people in the building and the sincerity of their intent. And, you know, Bragg is a Liberal, he's from the Financial Services Council. A lot of people have question marks over him. Is he really sincere, etc.? What we can say now is, as this inquiry has got more serious, Bragg has got tougher. And so his response to this refusal yesterday of ASIC to comply with this order to hand over documents was to accuse them of being in contempt of the Senate, right? Which is really tough language because guess what? We'll actually write an article about this, but in the history of Australia, there are people who've got this. You know, this comes under the area of what they call the privileges of Parliament. There are people who've gone to jail for being found to have attacked the privileges of Parliament. Parliament has enormous powers. They don't use them in this area, and that's why a lot of these committees are just so weak. They'll stay weak until Parliament, some privileges committee makes an example of somebody who is not abiding by the system, right? The transparency part of the system of Parliament is the best part of it. That requires people to be honest, people to cooperate, right? And if they're not doing that, and especially these people like government regulators, maybe some of them should find themselves in legal hot water. And hell, if necessary, go to jail.
Yep. Now on to the crooked bookkeepers. So you mentioned before the big four accounting firms who also function as consultants to government. So again, you have that overlap between these two different functions of the government and the policing. Now the people may know there's also a Senate inquiry ongoing into these big four firms and others. And that's led by Senator Deb O'Neill and Barbara Pocock, who on Monday in the hearing drew out a whole bunch of more interesting things that have than what already has emerged with the PwC scandal. There's a Deloitte scandal, it turns out, another breach of confidentiality, this time where people from Deloitte were passing on information from the Defence Department. So Defence Department probably does the most outsourcing of any government agency in Australia. So you have these external agencies that are privy to a lot of information and they go and pass it to their mates.
So this guy, this Deloitte partner, took sensitive or classified defence documents and he had friends who were setting up their own consultancy and he shared it with them. Now, we will follow this story, Elisa, because you mentioned it earlier. There's a war on whistleblowers in Australia, right? David McBride, our friend, faces 50 years in jail for being the guy who told the truth about war crimes in Afghanistan. The ATO whistleblower, Richard Boyle, if he cops everything, 150 years for telling the truth about what happens inside the ATO. With all this attention on the regulators, on the accountants, the consultancy firms by the government, let's see if it's sound and fury signifying nothing or whether it's real. Because if David McBride can face 50 years, what's going to happen to this guy who's obviously a buddy of them all, one of them, right? Someone who's just trying to profit, what's going to happen to him who on paper has done technically the same thing, right? Incorrectly treat classified information. So we'll follow this closely, and I want the viewer to pay attention to this story. If you don't hear of a Deloitte guy going to jail, right?
Well,
come to the David McBride trial in Canberra in November.
And we need to ramp up those parliamentary powers again because the chair of Deloitte, Tom Mbezi, refused to provide details to the Senate that were requested. Jeff Watson, a director at the Centre for Public Integrity, commented on that. He said, "I don't understand how companies which make hundreds of millions of dollars a year from government contracts can deny information to the Australian taxpayer." Now, and there's a whole raft of things, and we'll cover this in coming editions of the alert service, but they're using a partnership model rather than an incorporated company model to avoid CEOs having liability. There's a whole raft of things that are raised by this case. What they do is, and these are fascinating here because there's a KPMG whistleblower that was revealing a lot of this. But this is a feature of the system that we've known for a long time. Just to explain it quickly, in a partnership, the partners have all the liability. They are responsible for all the money and all the debts, all of it. A company is limited liability, right? And so you, in a company, if you're part of the company, you are liable for the money. If you're the owner, the investor, you're only liable for the amount of money you've invested and put in, right? And that has privileges, so that the trade-off for those privileges is transparency, right? And legal responsibility. So the CEO, the board, etc., they all have legal responsibilities that don't apply to a company, because the company is not regulated by the corporate regulator, because they don't apply to a partnership. The partnership's not regulated by the corporate regulator because it's not a corporation. Everyone that's exposed to that has those liabilities. What these Big Four accounting firms were allowed to do is conjure up a hybrid that gave them all the privacy of a partnership with all the limited liability of a company. And they even have CEOs who are just appointees in name only. The CEO when you hear Deloitte CEO, KPMG CEO, PwC, it's a meaningless term. They're a CEO. They're called CEO. They get money for that, right? But they have no obligations of a normal CEO of a company. None. It's just a joke. And the KPMG guy went through that. Everything is rigged in their favour. And what did also come out, which is I made this is already well known if you've been paying attention. We were screaming about this years ago. These 4 auditors audit all the world's biggest multinationals, all of them, and nobody audits them. They have an association of sorts. That's supposed to provide some form of oversight. It's as weak as anything. Well, the Deloitte chief executive in that hearing on Monday, Adam Barwick, he admitted the consulting sector operates without any clear oversight or regulation. Brendan Lyon, KPMG partner turned whistleblower, he called for a royal commission into the sector. And very importantly, former ACCC chief, competition chief, Alan Fells, demanded, and this is not the first time, the breakup of those Big Four consulting firms. He said that audit work is critical to the economy and shouldn't be compromised. Non-audit activities, he said, have the potential to compromise the conduct of audit. Self-regulation cannot be relied upon, here, nor can government regulation. We therefore need legislation to break up the Big Four and in turn other audit businesses, and to prohibit audit businesses from doing consulting, advisory and other forms of business because of this overlap. Good on you, Alan Fells. Just remind people, Elisa, we were ahead of the game on this. In 2019 we wrote a bill that Bob Catter introduced into Parliament calling for the Auditor General, the Commonwealth Auditor General, to take over the audits of the Big Four banks in Australia, precisely because you can't trust the quality of the audits of the Big Four audit firms, right? That's what we said 4 years ago, and put up a bill to that effect. The fact that this is all coming out now is great. What it's showing is a scandal that started in PwC is now just it's like unstoppable lava coming out of a volcano. It's spilling over onto everything. They're all in the firing line now, and this goes to the there's 7 institutions that have been central to the corruption of the global financial system, and it's these Big Four auditors and the 3 ratings agencies. This was really clear at the time of the 2008 crisis, right, where the ratings agencies gave bogus ratings and the auditors gave bogus audits, right? And all these banks went under. And it should have been the number one, paying attention to that should have been the number one reaction to that crisis. Instead, it was all swept under the carpet because the corruption still reigns, right? There was no intent to clean it up.
And if you're going to clean it up, you've got to unmask all this. And it's really great that here in Australia, this is looks like it's an unstoppable process.
Yeah, no, very, very good. It's going to lead to change if we keep pressing the issue. Now, talking about unstoppable processes, there's the war against whistleblowers that you mentioned. We want to move to our next topic, the Aussie scapegoat in the anti-China war agenda. Now, for people who don't know, there's an Australian father with 6 children. He's separated from them and from his wife at the moment in a horrible prison in New South Wales.
Solitary confinement in Lithgow jail.
He's been designated an extreme high-risk prisoner. So as you said, he's in solitary confinement. He's receiving very harsh treatment. He's got lack of food, lack of heating, lack of blankets, basic necessities, access to medical care, and very limited access to family, legal assistance and so forth. Why is he there?
Well, he's there because of nothing he did, because he's the scapegoat. And the old scapegoat is they put, the people would agree, we'll put all the sins on this goat, right? The goat can carry all our sins. And that's actually what's happened to Daniel Duggan. So Dan Duggan's a Top Gun. He was a US Navy pilot before he moved to Australia, and he became an Australian citizen. Now he's one of ours. He's one of our citizens. He's been a citizen for 20 odd years or whatever. He's got an Australian family. And we'll put as many photos up as we can. I mean, he has a lovely family, right? And I've met Safreen Duggan now, his wife. Met her a couple of weeks ago in Canberra. This has destroyed their life, right? And why? Because I don't even want to. I'm going to mention, 2010 to 2012 because that's on paper why, but it's not why. From 2010 to 2012, he did some work at a flight training academy in South Africa, and for that he is now serving in solitary confinement in Lithgow in New South Wales.
Extreme high risk.
Supposedly extreme high risk. That's not why. What the real why is because in the last few years, some very evil people in the United States and the United Kingdom decided that they want to pursue their unipolar. They will blow up the world in order to keep their status as the unipolar superpower, the Anglo-American superpower. They must run the world. They define the rules-based order where they write the rules. It's not international law, it's the rules-based order. And in reaction to the rise of China, which was always going to happen, by the way, before the European colonists went to India and China, Elisa, they were each of those countries was 1/4 of the world economy each because they've got the biggest populations. Of course, they were going to be the biggest economies. After centuries of being looted, they're starting to come back, right? And China is now rising. And so these people who think that they should rule the world, they've now got a country that's not going to let them rule the world in that way, right? And so they said, well, we're going to go to war over this. And that's what we've been screaming about on this show. And because that shift happened, they had to make an example of somebody. I just want to, this was testimony, forgive me because I didn't bring my glasses today, but just to show you how arbitrary what's happened to Dan Duggan is. In February this year, Air Chief Marshal Wigston in the UK gave testimony to the UK House of Commons. And the testimony was about this phenomenon that they're freaking out about now of Western pilots training Chinese pilots, right? That's what his testimony was about. He acknowledged that when they did this, there was no reason to think they were doing anything wrong, right? He said, training had been going on for, quote, going on for many years, and it goes back to a period when we, that is the authorities, the establishment, took a different approach to China. We took a much more engaging approach. We did training. It was formal. We had state visits. And the red arrows went displayed in China in 2018. So I can understand why those people who went and became contractors, helping in simulators and with flying, training at that stage, would have felt that it was a reasonable thing to do. That's what he said this year, acknowledging that in the context of the times, they did nothing wrong. This is all being retrofitted, right, to demonise what he did. But also, Daniel Duggan insists that at no stage did he train Chinese Air Force pilots. He did train Chinese pilots 10, 12 years ago, but he insists he didn't train Chinese Air Force pilots. But get this, what we've got is a series of articles that Melissa Harrison has written in the Alert Service, which are really, they're comprehensive, right? And what should motivate you to read this is these photos of these little kids, and his daughter there broke her arm recently. Look at her age, and she broke her arm. Our daughter broke her leg, right? Probably a little bit older than this. You want to be there for them at that time, right? She's calling out for daddy. If this guy is innocent, we should all be burning with utter rage, and everything we've seen shows that this guy is absolutely innocent. That's why you should want to know these details. But the Brits and Americans and Australians have had like this low-level whinge for years about losing their military personnel to higher paid jobs for foreign governments. But they weren't whinging because they felt it was a threat. They were whinging because, they couldn't match the money that these foreign institutions or whatever would pay, right? And so they're losing personnel. That's all they were whinging about. And they said, the problem is this is not illegal, right? In other words, there's official acknowledgements that it wasn't even illegal, yet under the Trump administration, and who knows whether Trump probably didn't even have a clue this was happening. People like Mike Pompeo, they set out to make an example of somebody. And what Melissa Harrison has shown in this series is there was a coordinated operation with intelligence agencies, the Five Eyes intelligence agencies, and especially the three that are part of AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom and United States, a coordinated operation to try and highlight this as if it was some kind of a threat to us. And that the pilots and other personnel that would be doing kind of training, they're not just training, they're handing over our secrets, right? That did a number of things. That allowed them to introduce new laws, more far-reaching, extensive national security laws, right, to crack down on protecting our secrets. That allowed them to do that. That allowed them to demonise, that allowed them to take this phenomenon of training foreign countries, and when it comes to China, say, this is China's way of trying to infiltrate and steal from us, see China as a threat. So to change the whole narrative, all that sort of stuff. She identifies the date at which suddenly, almost out of the blue, there was an eruption of press coverage in the United Kingdom to suddenly demonise all this stuff, an eruption of it. Yet, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. It coincided with this arrest of Dan Duggan in Australia. And the arrest of Dan Duggan was then reported as if it verified, it corroborated the hysteria over there in the UK. Yet you've got Americans like the Asia Czar, Obama's Asia Czar, Kurt Campbell, making comments like, before AUKUS, we were worried that the Australians and the Brits were forming their own relationships with China, right? And they were in danger of weakening our sort of strategic situation, right? So we had to bring them into line. And there's many layers to this operation of making sure that they take these three countries that each individually had perfectly amicable relations with China, suddenly turn that into absolute hostility where now we've normalised the talk of war. But in order to reinforce that, you've got to create examples that can con the people into thinking there's a threat. And in all that, when it comes to the pilots issue, Dan Duggan is the guy they made the scapegoat to reinforce that. And that's why, as far as we can see, that's why that man is in solitary confinement in Lithgow prison, waiting to be extradited to the United States, separated from his family, just so these evil warmongers can get their way and talk us into a war that will be a war of annihilation of all of us.
So he's the fall guy. And just to get the timeline clear, so June 2021 was when ASIO went to the Australian Defence Forces and revealed this plot to try train the Chinese pilots, right? That was 3 months before the AUKUS deal was announced, right? So you've got that, and then later on, ASIO head Mike Burgess said, as we progress AUKUS, it's critical our allies know that we can keep our secrets and keep their secrets. Then fast forward to October last year. So this is when the spate of media coverage that you mentioned blew up in Britain, October 2022. There'd already been, the story had surfaced earlier in an intelligence publication, but at this time, the British media just went gung-ho with this at the same time that the British Prime Minister, Liz Truss at that time, and the Ministry of Defence put out intelligence alerts about, be on the lookout for pilots that are training Chinese, etc. But this was exactly timed to coincide with trying to get this new UK National Security Bill up to provide new tools, as they put it, to tackle security challenges. So, yeah, this was all part of the drive to get this. I mean, it's the Five Eyes, all the intelligence agencies collaborating together, but as you said, particularly the AUKUS members of that, to consolidate that network aimed at China. And as many commentators have been saying in the wake of that NATO summit, and Kurt Campbell himself has admitted, AUKUS is a foot in the door for NATO expansion into the Pacific. 2 US senators on the Armed Services Committee have just said this outright, and Adam Creighton summed it up this way in The Australian on the 17th. He said senior Republican and Democratic congressmen declared NATO's expansion into the Asia-Pacific region inevitable, arguing that the AUKUS Security Pact, of which Australia is a key member, is the first step into turning the growing military into a global bulwark against Chinese and Russian power. And I just want to add to this that during that big spate of media coverage in Britain in October 2022, which coincided with the targeting of Duggan, the Daily Mail stated at that time, they said, as all the members of Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing network comprising the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States, were affected by the pilots scandal, a joint strategy as required to deal with it with every state is required to deal with it with every state agreeing to the same measures. So they were trying to pull all of us into line to have some external intelligence agency, the Five Eyes, which is the intelligence networks of those countries, not the governments, no one elected, to dictate how we respond to this and potentially to dictate war when the time is right. Now, Albanese, Prime Minister Albanese at the NATO summit referenced this same type of alignment internationally when he was discussing the impact of Ukraine and the war, ongoing war on the entire world. He said, security can't be considered to be just behind national borders because our world is so interconnected. Australia must be engaged and have a seat at the table. So this is what we're facing in terms of what Duggan personally is facing, but the broader agenda that he's the scapegoat for.
Yeah, what you just read there is the formula by which we've given up our sovereignty. Right? In their own words, they have to make us all step in. We're not allowed to make our own decisions on this, right? And so even the treatment of Dan Duggan is taking the same path. I want to read you this Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, when he gave his 21st February speech on the annual threat assessments. He singled out Dan Duggan, essentially, because he attacked, he said that ASIO had identified former defence insiders who were, quote, willing to sell their military training and expertise to foreign governments, a small but concerning number who are willing to put cash before country. Third-party companies have offered Australians hundreds of thousands of dollars and other significant perks to help authoritarian regimes improve their combat skills. However, the individuals rationalise their decisions. The bottom line is they are transferring highly sensitive, privileged and classified know-how to foreign governments that do not share our values or respect the rule of law. Right? Or respect the rule of law. What you just described, Elisa, and the article goes through, is this the whole raison d'etre, the whole MO of these Five Eyes agencies is to undermine the rule of law. They create pretexts to give themselves more. They change the law because the actual rule of law is too restrictive on them. So they create pretexts to give themselves sweeping powers, And in the case of Duggan, there's a thing called dual criminality. There's a principle called dual criminality that basically governs our extradition agreements in Australia. When we have an extradition agreement with a country, in this case the United States, we will only extradite to the United States if the crime the United States is seeking extradition for is also a crime in Australia, right? The Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, is the guy who signed off on Duggan's arrest, and that's the reason he's in jail. He refuses to answer whether what Duggan is accused of is a crime in Australia. And the fact he refuses to answer tells you the problem, right? Because it isn't. Yeah. It isn't a crime in Australia. What he's trying to do is bluff this in order to please the United States. But as I referred earlier, what Melissa points out in this series is it probably wasn't even a crime in the United States, right? What he did, if what he's accused of is true, and he denies it, right? If what he's accused of is true, it's probably not even a crime in the United States. I have this one detail that I got firsthand. The indictments for the people involved in the South African training school, there's a whole bunch of British pilots there and stuff. Those indictments go down to the level of mechanics. The mechanics there are also indicted. Do you know who's not indicted? The guy who runs the school is not indicted. The guy who had the oversight of all this is not indicted. And details like that tell you that, okay, this is a very suspicious operation now. In order, as we've identified, they've decided, so that people, when we tell people we're under threat and the Chinese are trying to grab our expertise, etc., so they think it's real, we've got to arrest someone, right? And that's what's happened to Dan Duggan. I'm outraged. He faces. If you're in Sydney next week, we'll put the details below.
His trial's coming up.
There's a hearing on the Tuesday, right? And there will be a protest outside there. Get along to that. There's something a few days afterwards as well. Get along to those events if you can, right? And add your support. This is he's not a whistleblower, but it's in the same. He's like the way he's being made an example of, the way Assange is being made an example of, the way McBride is being made an example of, etc. That's where it's in the same category. Yeah. All right. It is outrageous that this can happen in Australia, and his poor family. It breaks my heart.
Now we'll put links below to the two articles in this series by Melissa, so that you can read the details. You can also contact us for a full copy of the Alert publication, a complimentary copy if we haven't already sent you one, or you can subscribe to it, get it every week, and that supports what we do. That's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for tuning in, and see you again next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.